Lot 41. One dead boxcar in the dirt it's rusting on. County took it for back taxes 11 years ago. Sold as is, where is? Somebody start me at $10. Somebody in the third row didn't bother lowering his voice. Hoyt, that thing's been rusted shut since before my daughter was born. Then it'll stay shut for whoever buys it. $10. Nobody moved. Rain was coming down hard on Marlow Junction that afternoon, and the boy in the back row was only there because the folding chairs were free and the heater worked. 19 years old, 14 months out of foster care. A duffel bag, a cracked phone, and $23 folded into his sock. He raised 2 fingers, the way he'd seen people do on television. $10. The gavel came down before the room could decide whether to laugh. Sold! Young man in the back, lot 41. Booker Tate walked out of that auction house owning something for the first time in his life. If stories about second chances and buried truths stay with you, like this video and subscribe. We put out a new one every day. Now, let's talk about how a 19-year-old ended up in that back row with wet shoulders and nowhere to be. The road that put Booker Tate in that chair had not been generous to him. 6 houses before he turned 12, none of them long enough for him to learn which switch turned on which light before somebody packed his things again. His mother lost custody when he was 8. That's the part people lead with, and it's the least interesting thing about him. There were 3 things about Booker Tate the paperwork never had a box for. The first was his hands. At the 4th house, a split level outside Hagerstown with a garage nobody parked in, a push mower had sat dead in the corner since the previous spring. He was 11. Nobody showed him anything. He took the engine apart on the concrete floor over 2 afternoons, laid every piece out in the order it came off, and put it back together in the order it needed to go on. It started on the 3rd pull. He got sent to his room for the oil on the floor. He also mowed 4 lawns on that street the following Saturday with the mower they'd been about to throw out, and nobody ever asked where the money came from. It was the first thing he was ever good at, and he knew he was good at it, which turned out to be worth considerably more to him than the money. The second thing was that he did not ask for help. That one came from the system itself. When you're moved 4 times before middle school, you learn that asking is a form of waiting, and waiting is where kids like him disappeared. So he solved things first. He asked second. Usually never. A caseworker had once handed him a printed list of shelters and told him to call if it ever got bad enough. He carried that list folded in his bag for 7 months without dialing a single number on it. Calling felt like signing something. The third thing was his memory. Not for poetry, not for faces, for paper. Case numbers, placement dates, the name of every caseworker he'd had and which office each one worked out of. He could tell you the exact date a judge signed the order that moved him out of Hagerstown, and the exact date the next placement started, and the 11 days in between that nobody ever explained to him. When nobody else keeps your file, you become the file. He aged out at 18 with a backpack, an equivalency certificate, and 1 month of motel money from the state. He washed dishes outside Harrisburg. He loaded trucks at a warehouse until the contract ran out, and the foreman there shook his hand on the way out and said he'd take him back tomorrow if the work existed, which was the nicest thing anybody had said to him in a year. Booker kept that. He was 19 and broke, and he still walked out of that warehouse feeling like somebody. There were bad nights too, a stretch that October he doesn't talk about. But if you'd met him on the road that spring, you would not have met a sad kid. You'd have met a quiet one who could take your carburetor apart on a picnic table and hand it back running. He hadn't meant to stop in Marlow Junction at all. The bus that was supposed to carry him toward a warehouse job 2 counties over broke down on the state route, and rather than sit 3 hours for a replacement, Booker started walking. He took the first gravel road that looked like it led somewhere instead of nowhere, into a town of under 3,000 people, tucked in hills where the coal and rail lines used to run and didn't anymore. The rain started 10 minutes after he got there. The county auction house had a roof, an open door, and a heater running in the corner. People who own nothing don't go to auctions to shop. They go because the chairs are free. He wasn't going to bid on anything. He watched a foreclosed garage full of tires go for $200. He watched 2 acres of swamp bottom go to a man who didn't look happy about winning. And then a lot came up that made half the room breathe out through their noses at the same time. And a number got said out loud that was smaller than what he had in his sock. He never could explain afterward exactly what made him raise his hand. Maybe it was the phrase, "Sold as is, where is?" It sounded to him like a promise that nobody would ever ask him a single question about where he planned to sleep that night. The clerk who took his money slid a slip of paper across the counter with a parcel number written on it in ballpoint, 417B. Half a mile out past Tanner Road, follow the old spur, you can't miss it. It's the only thing out there. Booker read the number one time and knew he'd have it for the rest of his life. He walked out into the rain with a slip of paper and $13 left. He found it the next morning. The spur was a dead-end track swallowed in waist-high grass, with sumac and moss pushed up through the ballast stones over 40 years of nobody caring. The car sat crooked on wheels that had sunk into the earth. Its paint had faded past green into something that wasn't quite a color anymore. Both sliding doors were sealed. The locking bars had corroded into the brackets so thoroughly they looked grown rather than built. Booker stood in front of it a long time before he touched anything. He wasn't thinking about treasure. He was thinking about whether the roof leaked and whether there was enough steel between him and the wind to get through one cold night without a shelter bed. He pulled the locking bar until the skin split across his palm. He found a length of pipe in the weeds and levered it, and the pipe bent before the bar moved a quarter inch. He hammered the bracket with a stone, braced a foot against the wheel housing, and hauled with both hands until his shoulders burned and his vision went grainy at the edges. 30 years of corrosion had fused that bar into something closer to stone than metal. Around 2 in the afternoon, a sheriff's cruiser slowed on Tanner Road and stopped. The deputy got out unhurried, thumbs in his belt, and asked him what he was doing out there. He said it evenly. He also said somebody had phoned it in. Booker did not explain. He did not raise his voice or start a sentence with, "I was just..." He reached into his jacket pocket, inside pocket, left side, where it had been since the afternoon before, and pulled out the auction receipt, already folded to show the lot number. The deputy read it. He looked at the boxcar. He looked at the boy's split hand. "Huh," he said finally and handed it back. He got in the cruiser and drove off without another word. He'd learned a long time ago to keep his paperwork somewhere his hands could reach it faster than his mouth could explain. He tried 3 more times that day and got nowhere, but he'd figured something out by the second attempt, and it was the kind of thing his hands told him before his head caught up. The bar wasn't stuck because he was weak. It was stuck because the corrosion had welded it. Force was the wrong tool. Force would snap the bracket and leave him with a door that never opened for anybody. So he walked into town, picked up a dish shift at the Junction Grill for cash, and asked the owner for something nobody had ever asked her for. "You want the fryer grease?" "The old stuff. What you're throwing out anyway." Nadine Corbett looked at him a second, decided not to ask, and handed him a coffee can full of it. For 2 days, he worked that grease into the seam of the bracket with a stick and his fingers, morning and night, and let it sit. It wasn't penetrating oil, it was what he had. On the 3rd evening, a truck stopped on Tanner Road. Wendell Pike was 71, a retired diesel mechanic who'd spent 22 years keeping rail yard equipment alive before the last freight company pulled out of Marlow Junction for good. He still walked the old spur most evenings, the way some men keep walking a dog route after the dog is gone. He stood there a while watching a young man work grease into a bracket with his bare hands. "You're the one that bought it." It wasn't a question. Word moves fast in a town that size. $10, Booker said, and something in the way he said it suggested he still didn't fully believe it either. Wendell walked a slow circle around the car. He looked at the bent pipe lying in the grass, and the stone with paint on it, and the coffee can, and the split palm. "That's fryer grease." "It is." On a rail car. It's what the diner had. Booker didn't look up. You want to tell me it won't work, or you want to tell me what will? Wendell scratched the back of his neck and decided he liked him. Grease won't cut scale. It's what I had. It's been soaking 2 days. Booker wiped his hands on his jeans. It's not seized on the pin. It's seized in the bracket. If we crack the bracket, the door's finished for good. Wendell stopped walking. It was, he would tell people later, the first correct thing anybody had said to him about that boxcar in 30 years. He went to his truck and came back with a 4-foot breaker bar and a can of penetrating oil older than the boy standing in front of him. He did not ask why someone Booker's age had nowhere better to sleep. He'd lived long enough to know which questions don't need asking and which answers a person shouldn't have to give twice in the same day. They worked at 50 minutes. Soak, tap, rock, rest. Wendell put weight on the bar and Booker called the rhythm, back and forth, 1/8 of an inch at a time, because he'd worked out that the bracket would give up before the bar would if you asked it patiently enough. When the door finally screamed open on its track, both men stepped back from what came out. Not rot, not mildew, dust and old paper, and something faintly like machine oil, as if the inside of that car had been sealed away from time itself. The flashlight found the far wall first. The interior had not been stripped. That was the first impossible thing. Every other abandoned car in 3 counties had been picked to the frame decades ago. This one still had its copper, its tools, its glass. A fold-down table stood against the far wall with a chipped enamel cup on it and papers under a brass paperweight cast as a locomotive wheel. 2 leather suitcases sat in the corner, buckles gone green. A cot was folded against the opposite wall. A wool blanket squared over it in tight military corners. 30 years of dust lay over all of it in one fine, undisturbed gray layer, like snow that had fallen indoors and simply stayed. Lord, Wendell said, and his flashlight didn't move for a while. Somebody lived in here. He said it the way a man says a thing he's only half ready to believe. Booker stepped inside slow, the way a person walks into a room he isn't sure he's allowed in. And then he started noticing things. A calendar was nailed above a pegboard, its pages never turned past a month 30 years gone. A coffee tin on the shelf held a handful of pencils and a railroad company pocket watch, and the watch's hands had stopped at 6:15. Photographs were pinned in a row along the wall, men in striped overalls standing in front of engines, dates scrawled in the white borders in pencil. In one of them, near the middle of the row, a figure had been torn out of the frame. Not ripped in anger. The tear was old and it was careful, following the line of a shoulder. The pegboard held a full set of tools, each one hanging inside its own painted outline. Nothing missing. Except one. A short pry bar hung one hook off from its outline, and the oil on its shaft caught the flashlight brighter than anything else in that car. On the floor, against the back wall, a stretch of boards ran paler than the rest, sanded or worn, in a rectangle the size of a man's bed. And on the inside face of the door, in pencil so faint it read more like a shadow, somebody had written a column of dates. The last 3 were circled. Booker didn't have a word for any of it yet. He only knew one thing, and it sat wrong in his chest. The blanket on that cot was folded like a soldier's, and one corner of it was turned back. A man who leaves for good doesn't leave a corner turned back. Word that the boy had gotten the door open moved through Marlow Junction faster than the boy did. By the next afternoon, people who had never looked at him twice were looking at him once, carefully. He got a shift and a half at the Junction Grill, which turned into 4 a week, which turned into Nadine Corbett sliding a plate across the counter at the end of each one without ever using the word charity. You're not eating enough to be doing that kind of work out there. Eat first, fix things second. He ate. She watched him eat. On the 3rd night, she said the thing she'd been holding since he walked in. You know whose car that is. Auction says it's mine. That's not what I asked. She wiped the same clean spot on the counter twice. Silas Braddock, engineer, worked the spur before the company pulled out. Man just about evaporated one day 30 years back. Nobody ever cleared his things because nobody ever had the nerve to go in there. She stopped wiping. Some people in this town made their peace with that door staying shut, Booker. You be careful what you make them look at again. She didn't explain, and he didn't push. 19 years of being moved had taught him that people offer exactly as much as they intend to, and not a word more. He spent that week making the car livable. Wendell drove him out to a salvage yard on the county line where sheet steel went by weight, and they came back with enough to patch the worst of the roof and build a stove enclosure that wouldn't burn the whole thing down. Booker did the cutting. Wendell held things and made observations about how they were being held. The first night the stove drew properly, he sat on an upturned crate and watched the seam of the flue for 20 minutes to be sure it held. It held. And Booker Tate, 19 years old, $13 to his name, sitting in a boxcar in the dark, laughed out loud at nothing, alone, for the first time in longer than he could account for. Then he took his boots off, indoors, because he could. It was in the back of that salvage yard, walking past a row of pallets, that Booker had slowed down for maybe 4 seconds. Filing drawers. Gray steel, 6 or 7 of them, stacked and strapped, priced by the pound like everything else back there. Somebody had punched a mark into the face of each drawer, a small stamped emblem, a wheel with 2 bars through it. He'd seen that emblem somewhere in the last 5 days. He didn't chase it. He had a roof to patch and $13 to his name. He walked past them, but he was a boy who never quite let go of a number or a shape, and something in the back of his head filed the drawers away in the same place it kept case numbers and placement dates. At night, he went back to the anomalies, not because he thought of it as investigating anything. He went back to them because they didn't fit, and things that didn't fit had bothered him his whole life. The pry bar first. Every tool on that pegboard sat inside its own painted outline, a man's system, kept for years, the kind of habit that doesn't break. Every tool except that one. And the film on its shaft wasn't working oil. Booker rubbed it between his fingers and knew the difference immediately, because his hands knew things his mouth couldn't argue about. It was preservative oil, the kind you wipe on a tool you're putting away. Somebody had pried something up in this car. And then he had cleaned the tool that did it and hung it back on the board, just not in the right place, which meant he'd done it in a hurry, or in the dark. Then the floor. That pale rectangle wasn't water damage, and it wasn't sun. There's no sun in a sealed boxcar. Booker crouched with the lamp low and ran his hand across it. The grain was worn smooth in 2 narrow tracks about 6 feet apart. Cot legs. Dragged out and pushed back over and over for years. He sat down on the floor with the lamp in his lap and let that land. Silas Braddock hadn't used this car for storage. He hadn't stopped by. He had lived in here, long enough to wear a shape into the boards, long enough that the company that employed him either didn't know or didn't care. And that thought did something to Booker Tate that none of the rest of it had done yet. He knew exactly what those 2 worn tracks meant, because he'd made the same kind of marks in 5 different houses that were never his. He found the compartment on the 9th night, and he found it because of screws. He was sweeping out the back corner when the broom hung up on a board sitting maybe 1/8 of an inch proud of the ones beside it. He knelt. He pressed. It gave, barely, with a hollow sound the neighbors didn't make. Then he looked at the fasteners, and the whole thing opened up in his head at once. Every nail in that car was a square-cut nail, dark and old, driven by whoever built the thing decades before Braddock ever set foot in it. Every nail except this board. This board had 4 modern screws in it, and all 4 slots had been turned to sit in the same direction. That was not construction. That was a habit. A man who lined his tools up inside painted outlines, putting a floor back the way he liked things put back. Booker got a screwdriver off the pegboard and had it up in 90 seconds. Underneath, the frame had been hollowed out on purpose, the cut edges still showing the even bite of a handsaw. Somebody had built this. Somebody had measured it. Inside the cavity sat a steel strongbox, a leather satchel gone stiff as board, and a bundle of letters tied with twine so brittle the knot came apart in his fingers. His pulse was going before he understood why. Nobody hides anything that neatly by accident. The strongbox wasn't locked. Inside, a few $100s in bills that had gone out of style, a folder of survey maps, and copies of letter after letter addressed to the county land office, every one of them signed, dated, stamped, and never sent. Booker sat on the floor of a boxcar he'd bought for the price of a sandwich and read a dead man's handwriting until the lamp started to brown out. He understood maybe a third of it, but he understood enough to know one thing. Silas Braddock had not disappeared. He had hidden something, carefully, in a place he must have believed somebody would eventually open. The county records office was a brick building on Court Street with a counter worn pale where 50 years of elbows had leaned on it. Booker went alone. That was how he did things. He had never once walked into an office with somebody standing behind him, and it didn't occur to him that this was the day to start. He filled out the request slip himself. Name, address. He wrote 417B, Tanner Road Spur, because it was true, and because it was the first time he'd ever had an address to put on a line. Then the subject of the request: Silas Braddock. The clerk on duty was a soft-spoken woman named Dot Faraday, who had spent 15 years cataloging the county's older boxes. She read the slip. Then she read it again and set down her pen. "Where did you get this name?" "Out of the floor of a boxcar." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went into the back and came out with a thin folder that plainly had not been opened in years. There was always talk about Braddock, engineer on the old line, well regarded, right up until he started asking questions about how the railroad sold off its right-of-way land in the mid-90s. Then he wasn't well regarded at all. She spread the survey maps he'd brought beside the county's own copies. They didn't match, not dramatically. That was the thing about it. If they'd been wildly different, somebody would have caught it in 1996. The boundaries ran the same. The acreage ran the same. What changed were the words describing how the land had moved. Parcel after parcel along the spur, plots that had belonged to local families for 3 and 4 generations, appeared in the railroad's filings as purchased outright, for almost nothing. Braddock's satchel showed those same families had only ever signed leases. Temporary ones, signed with the understanding that the land came back when the trains stopped. Booker asked the question that mattered in the flattest voice he had. "What about mine?" Dot pulled his parcel and traced it with a fingernail. "Yours is clean," she said it almost with regret. "That strip under your car is track bed. The company owned it outright, free and clear, always did, which is exactly why the county could seize it for back taxes and sell it at auction with nobody able to raise a hand." She looked up. 40 feet of the only honest land on this whole spur, and it went to a 19-year-old nobody in this county had ever heard of. So it's the ones on either side. It's the ones on either side. She squared the papers with both hands, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone careful in a way that told him she was choosing every word. "If these leases are authentic, people in this town were told they'd sold land they only ever rented out, and somebody made a great deal of money on the difference." She showed him what the county had on the end of it. Braddock had gone to a lawyer, to the county, to the weekly paper. He'd been quietly accused of mishandling company records and pushed out of his job. There was one short letter to the editor, printed a month before he stopped showing up anywhere at all, saying he'd asked the railroad directly for the original lease files and been told the records were lost during a relocation of company offices. No follow-up. Nobody ever filed a missing person report. People assumed he'd moved on, the way men do when a town runs out of room for them. "So he kept his own copies," Booker said, "because he knew the real ones might go missing." "That would explain your floor a good deal better than I'd like it to." She looked at him across the counter then, in a way people had done for him so rarely that he noticed every single time it happened. "In 15 years, everybody who walks through that door wants to know what the land is worth." She paused. "You're the first one who ever asked me whether the man was telling the truth." Here's the part Booker didn't see. because he was 19 and had never had the luxury of assuming a room was watching him. The request slip with a dead man's name on it sat in a wire basket on that counter all afternoon. At 4 o'clock, a deputy assessor named Barry Lutz came through on his way out and glanced into the basket the way you glance into a basket. And Marlow Junction had fewer than 3,000 people in it. Hale Brantley came out to the spur himself on a gray Thursday. He came alone. No lawyer, no folder, no truck full of men. He parked on Tanner Road, walked the last 100 yards in good shoes, and the first thing he did was stand back and study the roof patch. Who taught you to lap that? Nobody. Then you've got better instincts than 2 men I pay. He put out his hand and Booker shook it. Hale Brantley, Brantley Stone and Aggregate. I own the quarry out on Route 9. He didn't come at it sideways, and that was what made it dangerous. He explained plainly that his loaded trucks ran 11 miles a day on county blacktop to reach the state route, that the old track bed ran almost straight from his gate to that same route, and that for 3 years he'd been trying to turn that half-mile of dead spur into a private haul road. Of the whole corridor his surveyors had quietly mapped, one stretch was still outside his control, 40 feet of track bed under a boxcar nobody had ever bothered to buy. So I'd like to buy it from you, Brantley said, and I'd like to overpay for it. He named a number, $34,000. Booker heard it and something in his chest went strange and light. That's cash, and that's not the whole offer. Brantley counted the rest off on his fingers without hurrying. There's a job in my shop. Engine work, hydraulics, real work, not sweeping. Comes with insurance, and 3 months deposit on a place on Maine, so you're not spending another winter heating a steel box with a stove you built yourself. He let that sit. Son, I'm not trying to take something off you. I'm trying to hand you the 10 years I had to claw for. And here's the honest part, the part this story doesn't work without. He meant it. Standing on that gravel in his good shoes, Hale Brantley did not yet know one thing about what was buried in the floor behind him. He thought he was being generous to a kid with nothing, because he was, and generosity that costs you nothing is the easiest kind there is. He called him son 3 times in 11 minutes. Booker noticed. He'd been noticing that word his whole life. I'll think about it, he said, which was the only sentence that bought him any time at all. He did think about it. That's the part people get wrong when they tell this story now. They tell it like he never wavered. He wavered for 4 days, and Nadine wavered for him out loud. Take it. Nadine. No, listen. She set the coffee pot down hard enough that 2 men at the counter looked up. I have watched this town chew through people with more backing than you've got. A lawyer costs more an hour than you make in a week, and that man is handing you $34,000 and a job. Her voice dropped. Take it. Let somebody else's boy be the one who fights. She wasn't wrong. That was the trouble with it. Every word of that was the smartest advice anybody gave him that entire year. So he sat on the step of the boxcar with the offer sheet on his knee and did the arithmetic he'd been doing since he was 15. $34,000 was 4 years of not lying awake wondering where he'd be sleeping in April. He had never in his life held a number that big. He almost took it. He wants people to know that. Then he went back inside for the lamp and read one more of Braddock's letters, the last in the stack, quoting what a company man had said to Silas Braddock's face in 1994. You're an employee, Silas, not an owner. This was never yours to have an opinion about. Booker read it twice, because he had heard that exact sentence his entire life. Different words every time. Same sentence. This isn't your decision. This isn't your house. This isn't your file. You'll be told what's happening to you when it's already been decided. 30 years apart, in a town neither of them had chosen, 2 people had been handed the same line by somebody who outranked them. That was the night it stopped being about a rail car. The letter came 9 days later, and it did not come from Hale Brantley. It came from a firm in the county seat, addressed to Mr. B. Tate, and it questioned whether Lot 41 had been legally offered at auction at all, suggesting the parcel may have been listed in error, given unresolved questions regarding chain of title. It was 4 paragraphs long, and it was built, top to bottom, to frighten a person with no lawyer into simply walking away. It arrived the same week as 2 other pieces of paper. The first was a notice of violation from the county, signed by Deputy Assessor Barry Lutz, informing him that the structure on parcel 41-7-B was a non-dwelling structure and was not permitted for residential occupancy. He had 45 days to correct the violation or vacate. Booker checked the date twice. 45 days landed on the exact Tuesday the county commission was scheduled to vote on a private Hall Road easement along the Tanner Road spur. The second piece of paper wasn't addressed to him at all. Dot Faraday told him about it herself, standing in the parking lot behind the records office because she'd been advised not to discuss it inside. It's called a records access review. Somebody filed a complaint that I pulled restricted material for a private party with no standing. She managed something that wasn't quite a smile. Which, technically, I did. For you. What happens to you? I'm on paid administrative leave until it clears. She saw his face and cut him off before he could get the apology out. Don't. I'm a grown woman. I knew the rule when I broke it. What she didn't say, what he worked out standing right there in that lot, was that the review didn't just cost her a paycheck. It cost him the county archive. Every map, every original filing, every box she'd been about to open for him. Locked indefinitely behind a door he had no standing to walk through. The lawyer Dot sent him to was a young attorney named Neil Trask, who took the cases in Marlow Junction that city firms wouldn't touch. He read the threatening letter twice, spent far longer on everything Booker had pulled out of the floor, then set it all down and said the only thing that mattered. They are not challenging your auction because of a clerical error. Your 40 feet is the cleanest title on that whole corridor, and they know it. He tapped the survey maps. They don't want your land, Mr. Tate. They want the file cabinet you've been sleeping on top of. Over the next 10 days, Trask filed motions. Booker did what he'd been doing since he was 11 with a dead mower on a garage floor. Took the whole thing apart and laid every piece out in the order it came off. The first thing he found because he could not forget a number. 2 surveys, one from Braddock's satchel, one from the county's published index that anybody could walk in and buy. Both described the same boundary in the same language. North, 12 degrees, 40 minutes east. 318 6/10 feet. Same bearing, same distance. Same physical line on the actual ground. Different parcel number. He'd read the first one 9 days earlier, and when he read the second at 11 at night by lamplight, his hands went cold before his brain finished the sentence. Nobody had moved a boundary. Somebody had renumbered the parcels. So a lease filed under one number and a sale filed under another could sit in the same cabinet for 30 years without ever contradicting each other on paper. It was not a forgery. It was better than a forgery. It was bookkeeping. The second thing he found because he'd spent his life reading his own paperwork. 3 documents converting leased parcels into conveyed ones. 3 different sets of family signatures. And on all 3, in the witness line, the same hand, the same tight backward slant, the same habit of closing an 8 so tight it filled in solid. R. Brantley, land agent. And then Booker Tate turned around and looked at the photograph on the wall, the one with a figure torn out of the middle of the row along a careful line that followed the shoulder. He held his own hand up to the gap. It was exactly the size of one man. He took the photograph down off the nail and turned it over. And that was where Silas Braddock had done what men of that generation always did with a picture. He'd written the names on the back, in pencil, left to right, all 6 of them, in the same tight backward slant that closed its 8s solid. Braddock had torn the man out of the front of that photograph. He had not been able to make himself scratch out the name on the back. 4th from the left, R. Brantley, Land Act. He died a few years back. The obituary called him a lifelong pillar of the community, and it ran a full column and it was almost certainly true. Booker took all of it to Trask, feeling something close to triumphant, and that lasted about 90 seconds. These are copies. They're his copies. He made them himself. I believe you. Trask sat back. Here's what happens. We walk into that hearing with a stack of unsigned duplicates a dead man made in his kitchen, and their firm asks one question. Can the county verify these against its own originals? He let the silence do the work. And the answer is no, because the only person with authority to pull those originals is on administrative leave, because of us. Booker sat with that. He could recite the bearing, the parcel numbers, the page, the date, the name on the witness line. He could have said all of it in his sleep, and it wouldn't have been worth one sheet of paper with a wet county stamp on it. It was the first time he could remember his memory being the wrong tool. He walked back out to the spur that night with a woman on unpaid leave because she'd been kind to him, and 41 days left on a notice telling him the only place he'd ever owned wasn't fit to sleep in. He didn't sleep. He sat on the floor with the lamp and the photographs, and somewhere around 2 in the morning, he stopped looking at the people in them and started looking at the machinery behind them. In the third picture from the left, 4 men stood in front of a rail marking machine. A squat, ugly thing on a hand truck, the kind that stamps identification into steel. Booker knew that machine. Not from a book. He'd had one apart at 16 in a scrapyard outside Chambersburg, on time nobody was paying him for, just to see how the die head indexed. Punched into the housing in the photograph, small and clean, was a wheel with 2 bars through it. He was moving before he'd finished the thought. Gray filing drawers, stacked on a pallet in the back of a salvage yard on the county line, priced by the pound. Same stamp. He rode Wendell's bicycle 6 miles in the dark and sat at the gate till 7. The owner didn't follow the question at first. Then he shrugged. Drawers came in 4 months back, out of a storage building some holding company liquidated. Nobody wants steel furniture anymore. Take them if you can carry them. He got the second drawer open on the tailgate of Wendell's truck. Bound ledgers, original leases, wet county stamps in blue ink, signatures, not copies of signatures, the actual pressure of actual pens, from families whose names were still on mailboxes 11 miles away. The railroad's originals, the ones lost in a relocation of company offices in 1994. Nobody had ever destroyed them. That's the part that still stops people. A company told a lie about paperwork being lost, and the lie was so convenient that everybody believed it, including 30 years later, the man who needed it to be true. Hale Brantley didn't hide those records. He didn't know they existed either. Getting them into the record was a different fight, and it started at a counter. Booker and Trask went to the assessor's office to file the ledgers, and Barry Lutz came out, took the stack of documents out of Booker's hands, and turned to Trask with them. It's dense material, counselor. Half of it's pre-consolidation numbering. He glanced back at Booker the way you glance at furniture. You probably don't understand what you're looking at, young man. Booker did not raise his voice. He didn't raise anything. He put one finger on the ledger in Lutz's hands. Page 14. Parcel 11-2-A, recorded as a conveyance in 94. He didn't blink. North 12 degrees, 40 minutes east, 318 6/10 feet. Same bearing as parcel 9-6-D in your own index, recorded as a lease and never terminated. You've got the other half of it in that drawer behind you. 2 different numbers, 1 line on the ground. The office got quiet. A phone rang somewhere and nobody picked it up. Lutz handed the documents back to Booker. After that, it came fast. Wendell Pike and 2 other men off the old crew signed sworn statements that Braddock had been pushed out of his job specifically after raising questions about the land transfers. Nadine Corbett came back with her father's original lease for the strip behind the diner, 30 years in a kitchen drawer, because she'd never believed anybody would care. She set it on the table without a word, which was the loudest thing she did in this entire story. And the few $100s Braddock had hidden under his own floor went out the door in 11 days. Filing fees, certified copies, the county's structural assessment fee, paid in cash at a window by a 19-year-old counting out a dead man's money. Every dollar of it spent finishing what the man who hid it had started. When it was gone, Booker was back to exactly what he'd walked in with. Brantley's attorneys requested a closed meeting. Trask requested the opposite, in writing, and got it. The county building, on the record with Dot Faraday present and 2 reporters who covered township business sitting along the wall. Hale Brantley came expecting to negotiate with a teenager. He found Booker Tate seated at the table behind 4 bound ledgers with original county stamps, 3 sworn affidavits, 1 lease agreement out of a kitchen drawer, and a filing that asked the commission to defer the easement vote pending review of every disputed parcel on the corridor. "This is a remarkable amount of trouble," Brantley said. "Over 40 feet of gravel." It was never about the gravel. Brantley's attorney leaned in with the softer version, that these were old, fragile documents, that authenticity could be challenged a dozen different ways, that it might be wiser for everyone to settle privately rather than drag the county through months of expensive litigation. Trask didn't argue with him. He simply asked the commission, on the record, to have the ledgers examined by a state document examiner in open session. The room went quiet long enough that the quiet became the answer. Then, Hale Brantley stopped performing. "I'll say this once, Mr. Tate, because I don't believe anybody's said it to you plainly. You cannot afford this. Not the years, not the fees, not what it does to a young man to spend his 20s in hearing rooms." He spread his hands. "I'm still willing to make you whole. I'd rather do that than watch it." It was the first time he had used Booker's name. 11 minutes on a gravel road, 3 sons, a $34,000 offer, a threatening letter, and an eviction notice. And it took 4 bound ledgers with county stamps on them before the man said, "Mr. Tate." Booker noticed exactly what it had cost to earn it. And Booker Tate said the thing that people in Marlow Junction still repeat, and he said it so quietly that one of the reporters had to ask him to say it again for the record. "You keep saying $10 like it's the size of me. $10 is just what it cost you to stop paying attention." The personal part didn't happen in that room. It happened 40 minutes later, in the gravel lot behind the county building, with the lawyers gone and the reporters gone, and 2 men standing between a pickup and a Cadillac. Hale Brantley had waited for him. "He taught me to drive on that spur." He wasn't making an argument anymore. He was just saying it out loud to the only person left who'd listen. Sundays, 78, 79, he'd put me on his lap and let me steer the company truck down the track bed at 4 miles an hour, and he'd name every family whose land we were crossing. He looked out at the ridge. Every one of them. He knew all of them. "I believe you." "Then help me understand how a man does both." Booker didn't rush it, and he didn't soften it either. "I don't think he thought he was doing anything to them. I think he thought he was doing paperwork." Brantley's jaw moved. "That's worse." "Yeah," Booker said. "It usually is." Brantley stood there a while. Then he asked the question he'd actually waited in a parking lot to ask, and his voice came out smaller than anything he'd said inside. "Are you going to let them put his name in it?" "I'm not the one putting it there. He did. In 1994, in his own handwriting, 11 times. Booker shifted the box of ledgers to his other hip. "What I get to decide is whether 11 families spend another 30 years being told they were wrong about their own land." They're not wrong, are they? It wasn't a question, and Booker didn't answer it like one. "No, sir." Brantley nodded once at the gravel. He got into his car and he did not slam the door, and that was the last conversation the 2 of them ever had. There was no shouting. Nobody swept anything off a table. Within the week, Brantley's attorneys quietly withdrew the challenge to the auction, unwilling, once the commission opened a formal review, to invite anyone to look closely at the rest of the company's dealings along that corridor. The easement vote was deferred. Booker's purchase stood, recorded and unchallenged. 40 feet of track bed, free of any further claim, bought for pocket change, and paid for a second time with a fight he never asked to have. The non-dwelling notice he handled himself, sideways, which is the only way anybody without money handles anything. He didn't try to prove the boxcar was a house. It wasn't one, and arguing it would have cost 6 months. He registered it as an accessory structure instead. A repair shop. He drew the plans by hand on graph paper at the diner counter over 4 nights. Framing, clearances, stove enclosure, the roof lap Brantley had complimented, and the county inspector who came out expecting to condemn something walked around it twice and signed off with an expression Wendell later described as personally offended by how well it was built. Dot Faraday's review closed 6 weeks later with a note in her file and her job intact. Hale Brantley never apologized, and Booker never went looking for one. Dot brought him the last piece herself on a slow Tuesday, and she didn't hand it over right away. Silas Braddock had not vanished. He'd moved 40 miles to a rooming house 2 counties over, lived another 11 years there alone, and died in 2001. His effects went unclaimed. There was no service listed. Nobody ever filed a missing person report on him, not because anything happened to him, but because nobody noticed he was gone. The Sowells drove out to the spur on a Saturday in October. Earl Sowell was 78 and walked with a cane he clearly resented, and he stood in front of that boxcar a long while before he'd say anything. His father had signed what he was told was a temporary lease in 1968 on ground behind the house on Quarry Road, and spent the next 30 years being informed by the county that he'd sold it. My daddy went to his grave being told he sold that land. He worked his jaw for a second. He didn't sell it. He just wasn't the kind of man they had to listen to. Then he took Booker's hand in both of his and held on longer than a handshake needs. That night, Booker did the last thing on his list, and it took him about 2 hours, and nobody helped him with it. He sat on the floor with Braddock's letters spread around him and matched dates. The column on the inside of the door had 3 circled entries at the bottom, and he found every one of them. March 11th. The day a law firm in the county seat declined to take his case. June 2nd, the day the county land office wrote back that no irregularity had been identified. September 19th, the day the weekly paper printed 4 inches of his letter and never followed up. 3 circles. 3 times a man wrote down the day nobody listened, so that the days would exist somewhere even if nothing else did. Booker took the pencil out of the coffee tin, worn to 4 inches, sitting there since before he was born, and added 1 line underneath. The date the county reopened the review. Then he put it back in the tin where it belonged. Then he stood a while looking at the cot, the wool blanket squared off in tight military corners with one corner turned back, the way a man leaves a bed he fully intends to be back in that night. Silas Braddock never came back. But somebody did. The sign at the end of the gravel path is painted on a length of salvaged siding, green over green, and it says, "The Braddock Line, small engine repair." There's a porch now, 6 feet of it, built with lumber the hardware store discounted without discussing why. Wendell Pike helped nail it down and shows up most Saturdays, not because anybody needs him to hold a breaker bar. Braddock's photograph hangs framed inside, the torn one, the gap left exactly as it was, and the names on the back photographed and framed beside it. The pocket watch sits on the shelf above the bench. Booker has the tools and the hands to fix it and has never once considered it. 6:15. Some things mean more left exactly where somebody put them down. $10 had bought him a door nobody could tell him to walk away from. Late afternoon, the compressor kicks on in the shop. A truck pulls up on the gravel and somebody leans out the window and hollers toward the porch. "Booker!" He gets up, wipes his hands on the rag over his shoulder, and goes into work. If this one stayed with you, leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from and which part got you. We read them. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's another story going up tomorrow. Thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next one.